Um, a lot of the research that I am involved in is with children and young people. Um, and it's very much about exploring who we are and what it means to be human, because it's still a big mystery for us to start to understand what it means to be human. So the research is about self, and part of that is exploring experiences, and usually experiences that people think of as unusual or anomalous. These are some of the words used to describe these experiences. And that's a really important part of this work as well. So what the studies are starting to show is that children and young people are experiencing these three different senses of self. Okay. And I'm going to share a diagram. Can you see that, Anoop?
Yeah, I see it
now. Okay, so it's easier for me to talk about this with this diagram. So there's three circles, these concentric circles. So children and young people identified three senses of self. And how did this happen? So this is about talking about what we did in the research. So we asked three simple questions in the research. The first one, which relates to the first circle, which is this one here, which is we referred to as the relative I. Yeah. We asked the question, can you tell me something about yourself? And we asked that question when we first met with children and young people. The second question was, why did you join the study? And many children and young people who joined the study were children and young people who had had unusual experiences. So that was their motivation for joining the study. So when we asked this question, why did you join the study? It kind of gave them an opening to talk about their unusual or anomalous experiences. So that was a good kind of question for that aspect of the study. And the last question was, who am I? And this question was linked to a particular research method that we used called Take a Selfie. And I'll come back to that because that requires a bit more explanation. Okay, so this sense of self. So the question was, can you tell me a bit about yourself? Immediately, children and young people started to represent themselves through narrative, through a story. And this narrative contained things like names and ages and friends and college and school and work and all those kind of objective things that we are in a relationship with in what we refer to as the outside world. Okay, and when we started to ask children and young people, what made you join the project? Do you want to tell me something about that? Then children and young people started to report their anomalous experiences. And this became really tricky because that whole narrative and that whole storytelling, it kind of faded away a little bit because some of their experiences actually transcend language. So in this aspect of the study, we started to use art, for example, and children and young people had to use visual images to try to describe some of their experiences. But what happened in terms of the self was that the self that they were trying to represent was no longer in kind of very tightly in that boundary of that relative sense of self, in that thing that we think of as conventional personhood. So some of their experiences were, one example would be empathic abilities, where they're with a friend and then they're experiencing themselves as themselves and also their friend. And some of the experiences are things like, knowing what their friend is thinking, knowing what they're feeling, but not just the emotion, but actually the physical sensations within their body. So that was pointing then to a sense of self that was very much outside that sense of personhood. And we referred to that as a transpersonal self because it was outside those boundaries. And in terms of the sense of self, which is really difficult to talk about, that emerged from an activity, from a research method that we have been piloting called Take a Selfie. And it's a research method that's based on some self-inquiry techniques that are often used in the non-dual teachings, that have a background in Advaita and these, these principles and philosophies. So we took those ideas and we kind of merged them with children and young people's idea of the selfie, which is it's a massive cultural thing with children and young people. So they worked really well with it. And the idea of the take a selfie is you're imagining a camera lens and a zoom function. And instead of zooming out into the world, you're turning it round, but you're going past the surface, which, with a selfie, it's normally the physical and surface. And you're taking that camera deeper and you're exploring the contents, whether they're thoughts or feelings, but more importantly, that inner story that they're looking at as well. So there was two ways that this knowing I emerged, and that was one way that emerged with children and young people. The other way was through young people who'd had a peak experience in nature. So they were trying to report a sense of self in those moments when they had a transcendent experience. And it was very difficult. They couldn't do that. So on this level, children and young people became very silent. There were no linguistic strategies to even try to explain their experience of self on this level. And all they could report was, I don't know, I just know. So we then referred to this as the knowing I. So this is a really brief nutshell of the senses of self that I've been picking up in the work that I do with children and young people. But what really struck me, Anoop, is how it resonates from what I do understand of your three minds theory. In sense of the first mind, it's very compatible with the conceptual sense of self and how you talk about that as it being a localized identity, for example. And there's a sense that you're lodged within these boundaries. And children and young people at that level were very lodged within those boundaries. And those boundaries and that qualia on that level of self was very conditioned as well, by institutional language, the influence of others, especially adults in authority. And you can see that very clearly. In terms of the transpersonal I, and you talk about this in terms of the second mind, where it resonates very well is where you talk about it, the self coming out of that boundary and meeting with these other kind of subtler things that are out there in the field. And again, it really resonates with that. And the third level of mind, now I'm not sure how compatible this is, but I think that it certainly touches on the non-verbal, how it can't be talked about in some ways. Yeah. So that's a really quick overview and just some thoughts really of where I think this really meets with what you're saying about your three minds.
Yeah, wonderful. Maybe, so if we can go back to the previous screen, where maybe I can see you a little better. There. Now I can talk to you a little bit better. Yeah, it looks very similar to the three minds framework. And it's interesting that I'm sure the children came up with this through their experience, through some way of describing their experience, and not through a theory about what they are. And that is the same for the three minds framework, is some kind of distillation of experience and exploration of identity. So let me share a little bit about that, and then maybe we can talk about that, this kind of convergence. Let's see. So can you see this, Donna?
Yeah.
All right. So the first identity, in terms of the one that's most accessed or the one that's most talked about and the one that is first given to us in a sense by the thinking world, is what I call the first mind, or M1. And this seems to correspond, as you said, to the narrative identity, the narrative self, right? And so this is the identity that we can clearly talk about. Why? Because language itself is usually a first mind construct, a first mind apparatus, really, right? So what is language? It's basically taking something, right? I'm not going to call it something, maybe you can call it experience, but whatever it is, let's just leave it as a question mark. It's taken something, and then it is bringing it within a discrete boundary, right? This is what language is. And so the easiest way to define the first mind is that by calling it a rigid boundary, right? So where the experience of identity is something like, this particular thing is what I am. And that thing could be this particular body, which has a perimeter around it, or this particular personality, right? This introspective or extrospective personality, this is what I am, right? These ideas are characteristic of the first mind. And inevitably, at some point, this idea that this particular thing is what I am is going to bump up against some other kind of experience in the world. And usually that some other kind of experience is explored through what we call philosophy or spirituality or religion or psychedelic experience or out-of-body experience. We have all these terms that are essentially suggesting one thing, which is the exploration and moving beyond a fixed boundary, right? And this is the movement into the second mind, which I think in the kids we're calling transpersonal, right? And in the word transpersonal, person refers to the first mind, or person refers to a rigid boundary of identity. So it's really transboundary is what we're talking about as the second mind. Now, what's interesting about this is that from the second mind perspective, right, which I would just call a more undifferentiated consciousness, as opposed to the differentiated, localized, concretized identity of the first mind. From this more undifferentiated perspective, the M1, the first mind, and the object that it is perceiving are seen as its own aspects, right? So whereas from the first mind perspective, I am this body or I am this personality, and now I'm looking at this screen and I'm seeing you, right? And you are over there and I am here. This is the first mind understanding. This is where most of science begins, with this kind of separation. From the second mind perspective, both of these are differentiated aspects of something that is more whole. And so from this perspective, then, what we call objects, which is what we're showing here, object is seen and experienced only in relationship with a person or with some kind of perceiving identity. And this is why when we look at an object, we can never actually see the whole object, right? Nobody has, even this laptop that I'm looking at right now, I've had it for years, but I've never seen all of it. I can only see one aspect of it at a time. And even if I had 1 million people all around it, nobody would see this thing called a laptop. All they would ever see is an aspect. And then cognitively, we have to stitch all those together and say, no, there is some external object, right? This is what the first mind does to preserve its worldview of an independently separate outside existing world. But from the second mind, transpersonal or transboundary view, the objects that we are seeing are co-appearing along with the subject. So this is kind of, we can say, a meta-subject and meta-object identity. That is the second mind, which is the transpersonal mind as described by the children. And then the third mind would be that which is prior to any kind of differentiation. So this is where there might be some difference between the knowing I that the children described and the second mind. In the three minds framework, the second mind includes the ability to perceive the world in some sense, to some extent, even if it's not as a discrete, externally independent world, right? So through the second mind, one can still appreciate the world, or the world can be kind of immersed or submerged back into this potential nature. And this kind of emerging and submerging is characteristic of this second mind. The third mind is beyond this idea of emerging and submerging. And that's why we'll see here that while there are lines connecting the first and the second mind, there is no line between the second and the third mind. And in fact, people can be very content exploring the second mind for lifetimes, because it is an infinite sea from which all the infinite particularities of the world, whether they're ideas or languages or objects or equations, all particularities emerge. And of course, particularities are infinite. There's no end to them. And so this is kind of an infinite dance. However, I would also say that a characteristic of the second mind is illumination, right? So we hear this in religion, in spirituality, in philosophy, this idea of light, right? So this inherent light, which is an aspect of this undifferentiated potential, this is characteristic of the second mind, right? To the point that from light emerges the distillations of matter, what we call matter experience in the three minds framework, right? But that which is beyond light, even light assumes a difference between darkness and light to some extent, but that which is beyond this polarity of light and dark, right? That which is beyond the polarity of the expressed and the unexpressed, this is what I call the third mind. So whether this is the mind that is referred to by children as the knowing mind, we can't say, because really this is a place beyond language at this point. Even the word transpersonal, which is indicative of the second mind, is beyond language. We're not really saying what it is. We're just saying it's beyond boundary, right? We can't actually point to it. So if we're talking about something beyond that even, really language would be futile. And so if there is any perception of any kind, then this is not the third mind, right? If there is any recognition of anything distinct, then this is not the third mind. If there is the noting of light as opposed to darkness, or darkness as opposed to light, or shades, then this is not the third mind. So the third mind is, what can you say? You can't even say potential, because I use potential for the second mind, right?
Yeah,
So say the third mind is potential. The second mind, then we can say, is potentiality, illumination, and its distillation as the discrete subjects and objects, so to speak, of the world is the first mind plane. And all of these coexist. All of these are here now, and all of these are always here, depending on the way in which this configuration of identity shifts, or what I'm very loosely calling mind. This is why it's called the three minds framework. Depending on how the configuration of this mind shifts, the world is viewed differently. The world is seen differently. What we think of as a world is different. Because from the second mind perspective, the world is simply a series of this M1O interfaces, right? And this aggregate that we hold as a cognitive concept is what we call the world. Even though nobody actually perceives the so-called entire world, we are always perceiving aspects of it, unless we go to its less differentiated nature, in which case more and more of it comes into view in its subtle form. So I'll stop here. But I thought it was interesting when you contacted me to note that what these children came up with, and this three minds framework, and likely many other frameworks around the world, are very similar. So why is it that children and adults, decades apart, countries apart, are coming up with very similar frameworks for what life is, or what this world is, or what identity is? I would love to talk about that.
Yes. And it says something for me about experience. And, when we come up with philosophy and theory and scientific measures and research approaches and all these things, they're never done from the experiential perspective, from the authority of people. And I think this is very telling in what you've just said, Anoop, about the fact that, for us, we live right across the globe, and we're very different on our level of our relative I, our first mind, and then there's children and there's adults, and they're experiencing a sense of self that is being talked about in religious doctrines, in ancient cultural myths, in now in scientific philosophy and all these things. So there's something very significant there for me.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you agree, but
I do. I agree very much. And I think that's the key. It's, are we looking at our experience and then creating footsteps, or what's the word, rungs of the ladder to match that? Or are we taking the ideas that we were all given as children and then creating ideas from that box, that toolkit? And I think for most of the world and most educational systems, it's very much the latter, right? So as children, we have some experience. And then by the time we start entering school, actually, by the time our parents start teaching us, our parents basically teach us what they know, which is generally the first mind, right? Unless someone is actively investigating this, it's generally first mind concepts of what we are. So our parents tell us what, this is your eye, this is your nose, this is your mouth, this is your hand. And now this awareness of the child starts to contract, okay? The non-conceptual awareness of what I am, maybe it's a second mind, maybe it's a third mind, starts to contract and say, oh no, look at these people who are taking care of me, making sure I'm safe, making sure I'm fed. They're telling me this is my eye, this is my nose, this is my mouth. So simply out of disuse, a certain range of awareness gets covered up or gets forgotten. And we train our children to narrow their frame into the first mind. And up to a certain age, it's okay if you go beyond that. You can talk about imaginary friends. You can talk about angels and demons. You can talk about other worlds, right? But after a certain point, they'll say, hey, now you're 5 or now you're 7, and that's no longer okay. Let's stick with the first mind here. So this child then grows up to become a researcher. And this researcher uses what? The toolkit that they were given as a child, specifically the toolkit that they were given by those who really were caring for them, at least caring for their bodies and taking care of them and had the best intentions, right? Because certainly something that is so associated with love has to be right, is the natural association. And so what's happening is we're building theories and ideas from very limited notions of identity. And identity is really at the root of it, right? Because we only know the world to the extent that we know ourselves, because in between these two is necessarily a lens. And depending on the nature of my lens, so too the world appears.
And the lens,
so
yeah.
If we can look at experience, naked experience, right? Even to call it experience is theoretical, I think that's inevitable with language. But if we can look at the nakedness of what is happening and then develop the fewest concepts necessary to kind of account for this, then I think we will come up with something like the three minds framework, or the models that children came up with, or the many systems around the world that are close to these ideas.
No, absolutely. And there's another layer to that as well. So with our primary caregivers, and we are developing this kind of closed and very conditioned system. And then we're also, that society and institutions can take almost a, dare I say, patriarchal role, which is kind of another layer of that parent.
Yeah.
And then they have their narratives. So that's another layer to how we that lens that gets constructed is very much informed also so by that as well, which again, and what we do when we try to understand experience in research with people and with everyday people is we don't take any of this into account, in the sense that we interact with that relative sense of self, that first mind, it's not a direct experience of the world, it's a conceptual experience. So even if someone is reporting an experience, they're doing so through that conceptual lens, which is very, very tricky. So it's thinking about then how do we facilitate in some way as practitioners or as parents, or how do we in some ways facilitate children and young people and everyday people to be aware and slightly critical of that inner story as well that's coming up, because I think unless that can happen in some way, it's very difficult to access more direct experience, you know, and then the tools to do that go beyond language.
Yeah. Yeah, very much so. The conceptual lens that you refer to, it kind of begins as conceptual for the child, you know, who's trying to understand this, what the adult is telling them. It begins as conceptual, but it soon becomes experiential, because there's, you know, as the second mind, there's no hard divisions among these concept and phenomenon and experience, you know, so it makes headway initially as something new, as something foreign that we eventually learn as a concept, but that concept drags along with it the entirety of experience. And that is why the very experience becomes constricted. And then we have to create new fields called transpersonal psychology, or, you know, spirituality, or all of these terms. Yeah, I think part of it, to answer your question in terms of how we do this, part of this is through conversations like this, just kind of describing what is happening, you know, in a way that I don't think anything what we're saying contradicts established knowledge in any way. It's simply adding context. It's adding new layers to what we're already seeing.
Yeah.
When we look at perception and how we perceive through the lens of the first mind, yes, it very much appears as light is something that ricochets off the external object and strikes my retina and creates an action potential that goes to the occipital cortex, and then there's an interpretation, and then it's, you know, it's broadcasted in the mind, and then I see. So that can still be very valid as a first mind explanation of perception. And at the same time, if we understand the nature of light differently, we can also see a source of light in a way that crystallizes. And depending on the range of light that we recognized, if we only recognize a subset of this range of light, then it looks like there is some light that is bouncing over there and coming back over here. So I'm just saying that it's all very consistent. There's no need to throw out the knowledge that we have, but we do need to have descriptions like this to add on to it.
Yeah, because I think the dangers with not challenging that you know, the very mainstream story and the very mainstream way that these experiences are understood and responded to is that people are suffering. So it's, for me, it's about thinking about different ways that we can understand this in a way that can reconcile, you know, that in that mainstream narrative that there's some very valuable and useful things. So it's not about chucking everything away, but it's about affording opportunities to ensure that people are not suffering because of that mainstream narrative that's stating that this is a reality and that experience means this. And again, that is very much, that's a lot about discourse, because you know, discourse plays a huge part in shaping our social realities. A huge part. It shapes our social realities, but it's also, again, shaping our inner stories, and there's this dialectic relationship. So it's coming that way, but then we take that and we're somehow, you know, absorbing that, and then when you talked about that can become an actuality almost, because we're then putting it back into that shared social consensus in some way. So there is an important part of this work, I think, that is challenging, though, a lot that mainstream narrative about reality.
Yes, because it challenges identity. If we really want to be honest, it challenges identity, right? Because all of what children are taught is what they still are, in a sense, when we become adults, when we become the experts, so to speak, right? The experts in what? The experts in what we've been taught, not necessarily the experts in what is. May or may not be, it depends, right? It reminds me of how, you must know this being in your field, how until a few years ago, you couldn't talk about consciousness in science, right? You couldn't, it was considered taboo, it was considered spiritual, it was considered religious, you know? Why? So now why the explosion of research in consciousness? Well, basically, the people involved have now placed enough stepping stones between their own sense of identity and the external world, right? As long as consciousness was something I had and that is not in the world, or that is tough to relate with the world, I cannot investigate consciousness by focusing on the world. And my entire training since my childhood has been to focus on the world. That's what school taught me, externally direct attention, because that's where the action is, that's where everything is. Well, consciousness is here, the world is there, my expertise is out there, I can't do anything. But fortunately, over some time, because of the talk about science and spirituality, people talking about this for a long time, the popularization of meditation, and many reasons in general, there began to be enough of a gray area between what I am and the world, right? That people said, okay, now I can throw a few stepping stones in between my awareness and the world. And now we can begin to investigate this. And I think that's because of a lot of the communication that had happened over the last few decades. So similarly, what we're talking about here is about challenging this idea that consciousness is only here, right? Challenging this idea that what I am is only this. Because the safety, based on the stories we've been told, the safety is in feeling what I am is only this, right? That's where it's safe, so to speak. And yet that's also where there's discontent. So there is this friction between accepting the familiar and moving beyond this kind of discomfort that is inherent in this very process of studying consciousness, or studying transpersonal awareness, or studying the three minds framework, which is why most people, most institutions, most researchers will prefer to stay within the first mind identity, or talk about the other stuff as simply philosophy or spirituality or religion. That way I don't have to really engage it, because I can kind of say that it's non-scientific in some way, even though science itself is a label that dawns through this kind of process of identity creation.
And it's really tricky at the moment as well, because within these discussions and these dialogues, there's a lot around the no self, and there is no self, and it's a very contentious thing, is self in social sciences. And there's a new movement of theory in social science that's referred to as posthumanisms, that is really attempting to decenter this idea of a self in there, and with really good reason in some ways, because that's always been understood from a very narrow view of what it means to be human, which tends to be Western, male, white, and everything else has been othered to that, which, if we look back across history, that's created huge oppression, silencing of people. And so it's a worthy challenge to say, well, actually, there's no self, and we need to just rip that apart and start again. However, and this might lead to a question that I wanted to ask about your model, there's something quite important about that sense of self and that anchoring and the idea of agency. And agency is really important for disadvantaged groups or vulnerable groups within society, whether it's children with mental health issues, people on the margins. That sense of agency and how we research with them and get their voice there and get their experiences and meanings there, somehow that has to be reconciled with this idea, well, okay, that's a relative sense of self, but look at this, there's much more here, and we also have to attend to this and be slightly critical, because you're not just that, because it's also very easy for us to claim that, but for very good reason, because there's battles to be fought in a way, You know,
Yeah.
we're living in very tricky times, as we all know. So that there's something about reconciling that. But that leads to the question as well, because something that my work has made me think about is subjectivity and agency. Because for me, I'm kind of challenging the social science idea of this is who we research with, the relative self. We've got to move beyond that. But then what happens to the active agent, or where is that sense of subjectivity coming from? And my intuition is that where your three is, that's kind of transcending that field of potential and the first mind. For me, I kind of find it somewhere there, although it needs more thinking about. Well, you can't think about it, but is it making sense, the question? So in your model, if I was to ask, where would subjectivity be an agency in your model? Because I think that's would be really valuable for the work that I'm certainly involved in at the moment.
Yeah. So subjectivity can be seen at different levels in the model, right? So subjectivity as the first mind is me, the individual, my first, what is it called? First person perspective, right? Is called subjective relative to the world. From the second mind perspective, that second mind is like a meta subject. So we could say that is subject, and all boundaries are the objects, right? So that would be including the individual human being, the individual body, the individual laptop, or the individuated or the discrete laptop, the discrete idea. These are all objects, and the meta subject or meta subjectivity is at the second mind level. It's only at the third mind level where both of these are not there, right? Where there's neither this subject nor object. Even as the second mind, let's say as the deep second mind, we can say that there's no real subject or object. But in a sense there is, it's just that the subject and object gets dramatically redefined, as opposed to our first mind world where the subject is one kind of discrete entity and an object is another kind of discrete entity. So subjectivity takes different roles there. I think it's very important what you said, that we not move into an area where we simply say there is no self, period, close a laptop and be done. I think that's problematic. The thing is, knowledge develops always, of course, relative to where we are. So when you have a world that is materialist, when you have a world that is focused on discreteness, to the exclusion of potential that expresses as discreteness, then naturally the pendulum is going to swing the other way. And then we'll have statements like consciousness is all there is, and there won't be any accommodation of any other perspective or even an engaging in conversation. That can happen because that's simply the pendulum swinging the other way. Or you can say there is no self, and somebody might just keep saying there is no self. Who knows what their understanding is? It may be helpful, maybe not, but it's simply a response to what our idea of the self is, right? From a functional perspective, from a practical perspective of where we have to go as a society, to me, it is the second mind, which is that space that we are looking for, so to speak, as a society. Not everybody, but if we're going to talk about the majority of people, what would work for the majority of people, it is this kind of second mind nature, where on one hand, we can experience the sense of discrete identity, right? But that boundary is not rigid, and the boundary is porous, and the boundary is open and changing all the time. And because of that, that boundary being porous, translucent, flexible, changing, because of that, the sense of identity is never restricted to only this first mind, right? And so that's why the second mind has this kind of emergence, submergence characteristic to it, right? This kind of waving of worlds, this kind of waving of identities. And that is really important because to function in this world, to express in this world, to have this conversation, we have to have boundaries, right? And we have to respect those boundaries. But when they become rigid and concretized, now I'm blind. I'm not actually seeing what's happening. I'm only seeing through the ideas and through the kind of caked perception that has been stuffed into the mind.
Yeah.
So I very much appreciate what you're saying. And I think part of that is going beyond the terminology. Mental health, mental illness, enlightenment, spirituality, religion, you know, all of these are loaded terms at this point. And I think we have enough knowledge in the world now that we don't need to stick to these terms, right? Enlightenment is becoming spirituality's version of mental health, right? Mental health generally sounds good, but what exactly is it? What is the mind? What is the range of the mind? If we don't answer these questions, how can we ever talk about mental health or mental illness? So we need to look into this language so that we can go beyond yes self, no self, discrete self, unbounded self, and start becoming familiar with our own experience, and then play with the language, use it as ornaments rather than as the actual pillars that we are relying on.
Yeah, because it does, the language does, it creates these realities almost, and it's a huge problem at the moment, and this is the thing that's causing distress, but and just thinking about what you said about the second mind and society moving into that version of mind, if you like. I think even just an understanding, a more broader understanding that as human beings, we are experiencing experience on that level, and in that way these experiences may not be understood as an illness or a disorder. These will be considered more of our natural experiences as what we are, which is far more than that person that
right yeah, it really opens up the range. It really opens up the range for what we consider health or illness or wellness or well-being. And it just opens up the possibilities, which is where we need to be, rather than fixing it in one place or the other, just saying, whoa, look at all of these possibilities, how we can see this differently.
But also have that defined as well by everyday people. And something about especially children and young people at the moment who are not as boundaried. The younger that we are, we're not as boundaried in that first mind for obvious reasons, that we're, as we get older, that becomes more concretized in a way and localized in. So, we have to listen to the meanings that are assigned to experiences, rather than what we normally do, which is come in with our highly conditioned, not just adult, but our professional, our social roles, whatever they are, and put that kind of diagnosis or even something as simple as interpretation.
Yeah.
It doesn't even have to fall into the realms of that rigid professional thing.
Yeah.
So there's lots of work to be done here.
Yeah. Well, thank you for doing the work that you do. It's amazing work. I haven't seen anybody doing this kind of research with children. So thank you for doing that.
Considered dangerous, really. I'll just go out and say that out there, put that out there. And but I think that is because it's how children are thought of. So children are always thought of in terms of becoming adult, and not so much a being in their own right. We make as adults, and rightly so in some ways, because there is safeguarding, and as adults we do want to protect our children, but we have to reconcile and balance that in some ways with seeing and appreciating children as beings in their own right and not being too quick. The children are having, and there's lots of children and young people who are having these kinds of experiences, and they're having them anyway. So it's not that we're coming along and saying, okay, I'm going to pull all this out of you and I'll put ideas into your mind about this. No, we're meeting them where they are, and they're already having them, and it's about opening up that space to explore them, not to tell them what they are, but to actually listen and learn from them about what does this mean. And that's the important part of it. And actually what's more dangerous is to not do that and to silence children or tell them that this is not real, or that you're being oppositional. That's far more dangerous than being very open and setting out to really explore what these things mean.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, you're
yeah.
starting a whole new important conversation about that. But yes,
Yeah,
I agree
and
with
it's
you 100%.
conversations, that I have been engaged in because,
Yeah,
it is a new area of work. And I mean, in terms of researching anomalous experiences in childhood, the last bit of research done on that was in the early 1990s, and it was very small, and it was very much about the positive. So it really focused on things like peak experience and relationship with the divine and spiritual experiences. But there's something about also exploring the more negative experiences, and doing that really carefully. But some of the research that I've been doing actually shows the positive outcomes for children and young people who have had negative anomalous experiences, that have not actually accessed services, but have either undergone this kind of self-healing process, but being held really well by supportive adults, open-minded, who are not kind of too frightened to just step back a little bit, because it is frightening for us as parents. It
mhm.
is so scary just to step back and allow that to come up and emerge in some way. Even I've had moments as a parent where I've had to kind of, but it's so important and it's so necessary.
Yeah, that's something I also think about, and I'm always playing with and tuning is where on the boundary you engage with children, with my own child, like, because you have to be versed in the ways of the world. You have to know what people think and how people think so that you can engage, and at the same time not be restricted to that, including my own thinking, right? I wouldn't want my child to be restricted to the way I think. So how do you communicate that? I think it's really by living somewhere near that line. Where we live, the line exists, so to speak. There is no line really. Where we live and how we live, the trail forms somewhere there for the people around us. And so I agree with you. That's
Yeah.
navigating that is important.
And I think you touched on reflexivity there, which is crucial. As a parent, you're describing your own reflexivity in a way of how you're acutely aware of your possible condition patterns that can come up, and be in that moment if a child or young person is trying to represent in some way
Yeah.
what their experience is. And I think that's a really healthy and helpful part. As a researcher, I do practice reflexivity in the type of work that I do, and also kind of playing around with the idea of a transpersonal reflexivity, because usually in research, as a researcher, if you're employing reflexivity, you're actually only looking at your social role. You're only looking at your conceptual self in a way, your social role. And you're always thinking about those power relations between you as an adult researcher, an educated one usually, and the child who's there. But the transpersonal reflexivity is almost taking it a step deeper, where you're actually looking at the Cartesian subject, all of it in some ways, and you yourself are trying to kind of move out of that first mind in order just to be more open to what's coming up,
Yeah.
really. And
Yeah.
it's an interesting process, but again, it's this work is very embryonic, and it's all at its early stages. So people will say, well, how many children have you involved? Well, in formal studies, it could only be kind of 10 to 15 in each study,
Yeah.
but hundreds and hundreds in terms of what you hear and then what starts to come in, and all these other things. So yeah, it's early stages, but
Yeah. And it may not be about trying to move out of the first mind. It may simply be about, like I said, being where we are and allowing that to be kind of like some kind of delineation, and there is that ebb and flow, right? There is that emergence and submergence. And so there's some strain in trying to be somewhere, having to be somewhere. There's a usefulness to that in order to communicate. For example, to communicate in the way I'm communicating now, the identity has to be in a certain range, right? Because at a certain range of identity, some things are visible and some things are not. And this is true for everybody. It's just that we don't vocalize it. So it may not be that we have to be somewhere, but rather it's useful to be in a particular range for certain activities. And I think there's much less strain in that. And otherwise, if there's no particular activity that commands attention, have at it.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah.